So I want to thank you for your patience and for joining us for today's webinar, Dispute Resolution Made Easy, using CADRE's newly released parent guides. I'm Marshall Peter, the Director of the Center for Appropriate Dispute Resolution in Special Education, also known as CADRE. Today I am honored to be a part of a distinguished panel of national leaders. Joining us on the panel today are Ruth Ryder, who is the Deputy Director of the Office of Special Education Programs, OSEP, at the U.S. Department of Education. In this position, she's providing national leadership in moving special education accountability to a more results-oriented focus. In addition, she is focusing attention on ensuring that the needs of children with disabilities are addressed in the major initiatives of the department, such as ESEA flexibility, school improvement grants, and early learning. I'm going to go ahead and introduce all of the panelists now, and then we'll get right into the thick of it. Jan Sirak is the co-director of the Region 4 Parent Technical Assistance Center at Wisconsin's Parent Training and Information Center, an 18-year partner administering the Wisconsin Special Education Mediation System, and the parent of a young adult son with autism. Miriam Alizo is the bilingual parent group specialist for the START project at SPAN in New Jersey, project assistant for the Center for Parent Information and Resources, SIPR, and director of the OSEP Spanish Glossary Project. Heather Hebden is the associate director of PAVE, Partnerships for Action, Voices for Empowerment. A part of the Parent Training and Information Network for over 30 years, Ms. Hebden feels the more we can help families understand their options, the greater their desire to work in collaboration. Bob Rutten works in the North Dakota Department of Public Instruction, a small state education agency where he and his special education team members wear multiple hats. And finally, but not least, Carmen Sanchez is a project officer in the Office of Special Education Programs at the U.S. Department of Education, working mostly with parent centers across the nation and the new Center for Parent Information and Resources. So with that, a truly distinguished panel, I'm going to hand it over to Ruth Ryder.
Thank you, Marshall. I appreciate the opportunity to be involved with this call. This is very important work, and we're very excited to be involved with sharing it more broadly. The part that I'm going to be talking about today is how the dispute resolution parent guides, how those fit into our broader results-driven accountability agenda. I think many of you probably know that about a year and a half ago, OSEP began a journey to totally revise our accountability system to have more of a results focus. The IDEA indicates that our primary monitoring focus should be on improving educational results and functional outcomes for all children with disabilities, as well as ensuring that the requirements of the IDEA are met. In the past, the focus of our work was on ensuring that states meet the IDEA procedural requirements. And what we found over the 9 years that we were focusing on procedural compliance was that states' general supervision systems were improving, their data quality was improving, the timeliness of the submission of their data was improving, and overall their compliance rates as measured in the state performance plan and annual performance report were improving. But what wasn't improving was but performance on reading and math assessments and graduation rates. Although we were seeing slight improvements, we weren't seeing the level of improvement that we wanted to see. Next slide, please. So we began to work on looking at how we could revise our accountability system to ensure that all components of the system were aligned in a manner that best supports states in improving results for infants, toddlers, children, and youth with disabilities and their families. And in doing that work, we developed a set of core principles that we followed, and those included partnerships with stakeholders. The system needed to be transparent and understandable to educators and families. It needed to drive improved results. It needed to protect the rights of children and families, and a few others. The whole idea was being that although we are shifting our focus to results, we are not giving up our focus on compliance. Compliance is important. We're just going to be looking at it in a different way. And in looking at the components of our accountability system, those include the state performance plan and annual performance report, determinations, and the third component is differentiated monitoring and technical assistance that supports improvement in all states, but especially in low-performing states. And in looking at differentiated technical assistance and support, we have a multi-tiered system of support that includes universal support to states, targeted support, and intensive support to states that have the most needs. And this work on the dispute resolution procedures fits into our universal support. As we were making this shift to results-driven accountability, we felt like it was very important to ensure that states all fully understood their responsibilities related to complaints, due process hearings, mediation, and resolution sessions. And we felt like a good way to approach that was through a Q&A document. Next slide, please. So in July of 2013, we issued a comprehensive Q&A document that provides parents, parent training and information centers, school personnel, SEAs, LEAs, advocacy organizations, and other interested parties with information to facilitate appropriate implementation of the IDEA dispute resolution procedures. And as I said, that includes state complaints, mediation, due process hearings, and resolution meetings. At the leadership conference last August, we conducted a session that focused on the Q&A document and identified some of the key questions and issues that parents, advocates, states, LEAs, and others have asked OSEP, that address the concerns related to dispute resolution procedures. At that time, we decided that we also wanted to help facilitate the development of resources that specifically address a parent's need for information about IDEA's dispute resolution procedures. The Q&A that we developed was quite a lengthy document and very technical in some of its questions. And we felt like it would be helpful to have information for families that really related specifically to the issues that they might have related to complaints and mediation and so on. So we looked to our partners at CADRE as experts in dispute resolution to help make this happen. And on behalf of OSEP, I want to thank all of you for your interest and participation in today's webinar, and to thank you for the work that you do on behalf of children with disabilities and their families. I also want to extend my thanks to the staff at CADRE for partnering with OSEP on this project. When I approached Marshall and his staff with this task and said we really wanted this very quickly following the release of the Q&A, Marshall and his staff just really approached it with great vigor and met every timeline that I set. So I really sincerely appreciate that. I also want to thank Lisa Pagano here in the department, who was the point person for OSEP on this and worked through many drafts and with many people to get this Q&A document out the door, and also collaborated with Marshall and his colleagues at CADRE to develop the parent guides. So this afternoon, you'll be hearing from other partners in this effort, and we'll learn how these materials are being used by states and local programs to support parents in understanding the IDEA options for resolving special education disputes. Now I'd like to turn it over to Marshall, who's going to tell you about the collaborative process that was used to develop these important resources.
Thank you very much, Ruth. I want to just echo what you said about how much this has been really a team-based undertaking. The support that we receive from you and from OSEP, and you mentioned Lisa Pagano, for us here at CADRE, Lisa actually came out and rolled up our sleeves and sat at the table with us for what I think was probably a grueling day and a half to 2 days where we really banged hard on this stuff, has just absolutely been a spectacular partner. And also Tina Diamond, our project officer, Hillary Tabor, Jennifer Wolfheimer, and Carmen Sanchez, all just incredible contributors to this work, but especially a tip of the hat to Lisa and Tina. Here at CADRE, we really, as a team, mobilized. Amy Whitehorn was really our internal point person, but this was a very thick discussion for all of us, and so we spent a lot of time and energy. Additionally, Anita Engels, Phil Moses, Noella Bernal were part of the CADRE team that was involved. As we did this work, we faced a number of substantial challenges, as in fact we're facing one right here. Now that we've decided to have a national webinar, the groundskeepers here at CADRE have decided that they want to bring in a bunch of heavy mowing equipment, so I'll try to maintain my focus. The challenges that we faced, I think the principal one and the one around, or the two around which we had maybe the most sort of challenging and fascinating discussions had to do with how it was that you could balance the use of legal terminology while at the same time maintaining critical meaning, how it is that you could ensure readability and at the same time be legally sufficient. So I suspect that it comes as that it confirms the understanding that all of us have that the law is inordinately complex. It's very difficult to understand. There are many words that are very carefully chosen, and so any time that we chose to substitute a word for a word that was in the law, we did that very mindful of the fact that we needed to preserve critical meaning. So fascinating discussions, at times voices very definitely raised as people felt strongly about their position related to whether a change could be made and how we could really advance readability. But when at the end of the day we reached consensus and ended up then with the 4 products. The 4 parent guides, which we're hoping that many of you have seen by now, have been very widely publicized and disseminated. So we, at the point that they were ready to go, they were posted on the CADRE website with a banner. They were publicized in the CADRE Caucus, which is our online newsletter that goes out to I think right around 5,000 people, disseminated through the CADRE listservs, and we set out to print and disseminate print-based versions, both because we felt like it would be helpful and useful to have print-based versions, but also being very mindful of the continuing digital divide and recognizing that some of the audiences who we most hoped would in fact avail themselves of these guides and find them useful might not have the kind of computer access, might not have the kind of bandwidth that would allow them to really usefully use the documents online. We went about trying to figure out how it is that we might most effectively distribute. We printed in English. Our initial edition was a total of almost 70,000 documents, because of our predisposition as a center towards mediation, we printed a few more mediation documents than we did complaint, hearing, and resolution meeting documents, but we sent bundles of these documents out. We used several different filters to try to figure out how to allocate. So we allocated the shipments that we sent to state education agencies based on child count, so that states that had large numbers of kids got more publications than states who had small numbers of kids. For parent centers, we actually, Carmen helped us, and we did our parent center allocations based on the size of the funding awards. And so centers that received larger federal grants got more publications, and centers that received smaller amounts of federal grants got smaller allocations. So we shipped all of those out. We also, at the point that we had not gotten much in the way of pushback, like basically no pushback, we then proceeded to have the documents translated into Spanish. We used a firm that had been doing Spanish language translations for CADRE, and really a very large national company, provided them with the OSEP glossary and had them conduct the translations. And then we invited Miriam Alizo, who I introduced earlier, and who was the director of the OSEP Spanish Glossary Project, to review the documents and identify any potential problems or areas that we could adjust. After inputting then her feedback, we proceeded and produced Spanish language versions of the document, and have now disseminated more than 30,000 Spanish language documents. What we used to determine size of allocations there were national population statistics, so that areas that had larger Spanish-speaking populations received more of the documents. Stepping back, though, for a minute, at the point that we had products that we felt comfortable about, and it really would be easy for me to understate how much time it took us to get, how many person hours to actually get to documents that we felt good about. We then sent those documents out to 6 parent leaders. Miriam Alizo, who works at SPAN and SIPR, Charmin Barrett, who works at the Pacer Center, Nora Thompson, who works at the Region 6 Parent Technical Assistance Center and Matrix, Jan Sirik, who works for the Region 4 Parent Technical Assistance Center and at Wisconsin Facets, Connie Hawkins, Region 2 Parent Technical Assistance Center and ECAC in North Carolina, and Liz Healy from the Peel Center. For those of you who are part of the parent network, you will, and others of you, you will realize that we really went to an extraordinary group of very smart, uncompromising leaders who have personal traditions of letting you know exactly what it is that they think. So we were delighted to receive extensive feedback from our reviewers. We sat down then and entered into another, quite frankly, demanding process of going through their comments and figuring out how best to integrate and reflect them in the final form. I also want to mention John English. There was this, I had this momentary crisis of confidence shortly before the document was given to the printers. This was, for us, a very, very large printing project. We've shied a bit away from doing stuff on paper, and the day before we were going to pull the plug on printing, I called up John, who some of you will know is a lawyer and the director of the Western Regional Resource Center, so very, very familiar with the content, and called up and asked him if, as a favor he would read through the 4 documents and just be sure that there wasn't any sort of a problem or a typo that something we had missed. Because we had spent so much time looking at these documents over the preceding couple of months, over time, if you look at the same thing over and over again, you may not notice a glaring error. John, bless his heart, stepped right up, read it, gave us the thumbs up, and we proceeded to printing. So then, what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Jan Sirik, who can talk to you a little bit about her role on the product review team and her experience with the documents. So, Jan? And Jan, what you'll want to do is press #6 to unmute your phone. At this point, I can't hear you.
All right.
There you go.
Can you hear
Perfect.
me?
Yes,
All right,
thank you.
good. Thanks. Well, I was delighted to serve on the product review team during the development of these guides. You know, as a parent of a son with autism and the co-director of our Wisconsin PTI and the region for PTAC and also on the CADRE advisory board, you know, I think I tried to look at it from all of those different lenses. In reviewing the guides, the first thing I looked at was to make sure that the language was really family friendly. So I really tried to look at making sure the reading level was, you know, as low as I could get it. The other thing that I was looking at was clarifying, you know, any kind of mediator jargon, you know. So when, for example, the first time it popped up to say participants in mediation, for example, you know, I changed it to parents and educators. And the other thing I was looking at was to try to, even though these were guides that were specifically targeting parents, I really wanted to have them, as much as possible, balance the parent-educator sort of partnership wherever possible. So, you know, for example, one of the guides said parents and family members may feel at a disadvantage if they don't take time to prepare for the mediation session. And I changed it to parents and educators because I think they both feel that way. And, you know, we want to continue to stress that, you know, people should be preparing for these processes similarly, and you know, not one advantage over the other. Another part, it said that the parents do not have to pay for mediation. So I, you know, recommended changing it to, you know, the LEA school and the school district and parents don't have to pay for mediation. You know, I like the way that these guides were separated into, you know, like a section for benefits and other things to consider, frequently asked questions. So I was just looking for ways to, you know, add new ideas. So, you know, one of the things that I added to the benefits section, for example, in the mediation section was that mediation is forward-looking. You know, the other processes always look at things that have already happened, or, you know, when a due process hearing, it's looking at, you know, one thing in the past, but mediation gives you the opportunity to be forward-looking. So I wanted to make sure that that was included. You know, the other things to consider section, you know, I just looked at it from the lens of things that parents have asked our PTI staff, for example, about resolution meetings. You know, to make it clear that resolution meetings are mandatory when due process hearings are requested, but to make it, you know, make it noted that when people are, you know, forced to meet, they have to go through the process and don't have, you know, they might just go through the process and have no real interest in settling. You know, trying to, you know, just give people some thought about these things. Resolution meeting, just some complex situations might require a few of the meetings in order to reach agreement, so that parents know that it's not just one meeting, but it's multiple meetings. I wanted to make sure that they knew that IDEA is silent on confidentiality at the current time, and that things in a resolution meeting could be used for a due process hearing or civil lawsuit. So I just, you know, I just kept looking for things that, you know, our staff has run across and tried to at least suggest that those be added in the revision. You know, to the frequently asked questions, I added something like, say, to the written state complaints, a question about what if I want to withdraw my complaint, so that, that because that one wasn't in there. So just continuing to look at it with those different lenses. The value of these 4 guides has been huge to our Parent Center in Wisconsin, for example, and it's at a level where it's very usable for the families that we serve, underserved families and others. We have been passing out really, so we really appreciate getting the paper copies, because we have been passing out a ton of these at exhibits all over the state since we got them. And so we were delighted to get, the boxes of them, and, very, very excited. Too often, I think we get materials from national PA centers that aren't usable for our parents. And I think because of the process that you use with this, these are certainly materials that we can use immediately. Our staff is using them to provide information to parents about the processes, so they're emailing them. The link to the website, they're mailing them out. When we are actually preparing a parent to participate in one of these processes, they're starting to use the book and make sure that the parent has that in their hand. The other thing that I wanted to say is, you mentioned that Wisconsin Facets, and I've been an 18-year-old partner on our mediation system here in Wisconsin, and so we are using the booklets for our Wisconsin Special Ed mediation systems for our state, and also for handouts for our workshops that we do. I questioned our Region 4 parent centers, and similarly, they're using them to distribute to parents and professionals at exhibits, and both to parents and professionals. So that's about it from my perspective. But thanks for letting me participate.
Great. Thank you very much, Jen. You've been a tremendous partner, and I'll turn it over now to Miriam Alizo. Miriam? And Miriam, if you will press #6, it will unmute.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me now?
Great. Yes, thank you.
Hi, everyone. When I reviewed the guides back in November, December, I used the perspective of a person who came from another country, a parent who has navigated the special education process for my own daughters, and someone who has worked with many families whose only language is Spanish. So a lot of the families we work with also face the barrier of being undocumented, in addition to the language and cultural challenges. I also remember that the original CADRE guides didn't mention that parents could ask for or bring support people to the mediation. So this new information is very inviting for families to choose mediation now, I believe. When I first reviewed the original guides in English before they were reviewed by the team, I noticed that there was no reference to parents having the right to have the dispute resolution meetings, like mediation, due process, and resolution meetings in their language. So I commented that CADRE guides needed to address the needs of immigrant families who do not speak English. The guides now emphasize that it is important that parents understand and are able to participate fully in the dispute resolution options, and that parent guides state clearly that parents should communicate if they need an interpreter. I also found fascinating that on the dispute resolution parent guides, there are recommendations for parents to prepare for dispute resolution meetings that can be used by families to better participate at any other school meeting, like an IEP, conference, etc. So these guides include very good collaboration tips for families. For many immigrant families, all these dispute resolution processes are extremely intimidating. The new guides help families understand that even though they or their children are immigrants, they still have the same rights in the special education process as the rest of the population, and that they can always get the help they need from the parent centers in their states. Several parents that already have seen the guides have commented to me that they love the Q&A section. It's crucial for understanding the topics. As a parent staff myself, I find the guides very useful when talking with our families because they can be seen easily in mobile devices. Remember that many of our families do not have computers at home, but most of the families do have smartphones and some do have tablets. The legal terminology could be very unfamiliar in any language to our families. So it is very important for me, it was very important to me to make sure that the translation was consistent with the translation of the special education terminology that already exists on the OSEP Spanish glossary. So even though the guides translated by the translation service used by CADRE were grammatically correct, in some instances they didn't reflect the way terms are translated in the OSEP Spanish glossary. Some phrases didn't sound natural, so they had to be adjusted a little bit to make them friendlier to parents, centers, and families. The OSEP glossary translates technical terms such as names of specific laws and national programs, and also common educational terms. In several cases, the translation service could use different translations for some specific terms. So I had to change them to be consistent with the OSEP glossary. The OSEP glossary includes over 300 special education, ed, and early intervention terms. The glossary helps to give uniformity to the final product. Another example of the use of the OSEP glossary was with the term homeless child. It was translated as niño indigente, a term that, even though is correct in Spanish, carries a very negative connotation. It could be interpreted as offensive. The guides are for families. I had to change that term to avoid offending families that struggle to have a home. A much better term for the homeless is the term sin hogar, and that term was already analyzed by the OSEP Spanish Glossary review team. The original translation before my revision was definitely not culturally appropriate and sensitive in some of the terms. A couple of times the original translation used very sophisticated vocabulary, so I changed some words here and there to make it more understandable. I really recommend anyone working in the disability field to consult and use the OSEP Spanish Glossary when translating to Spanish. And the OSEP Glossary is available online, and there is a printable version too, as well as our guides, the CADRE guides, can be used in mobile devices too. So that is all from my perspective, Marshall.
Miriam, thank you so much. As folks can tell, Miriam was just an invaluable asset to this project, both in general and also particular to the Spanish language versions. And so we were really delighted to have Miriam join CADRE's National Advisory Board, where she's just stepped right up and immediately become a critical player. So Bob, are you there in North Dakota?
I am. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. Hi, Marshall. Well, I think something that I really want to emphasize is when we first received copies of the new materials from CADRE, we were just so impressed. And the first thing I did was show the materials to a friend who is also a parent of a young person with a disability. And I really value this parent's opinion and respect her take on issues. And she said to me right away, there's so much white space. They use highlighted language, not so off-putting. And I knew that we were really onto a great resource because it was meaningful to her. And she thought this would really
And Bob, could you speak up? Would you speak up just a tiny bit, Bob? I apologize for interrupting you.
Nope, not a problem. I'll
Perfect.
do my best to be a little louder. Anyway, this parent really helped steer some of my own thinking on this, and it really helped us pursue the full utilization of these new options that we had from CADRE. And something else that really appealed to me as well as my colleagues at the State Education Agency, we recognized that not only was this resource, the new resources well written, but they had that OSEP review and involvement in the process, so we were confident in the content. And it kind of made us feel like this was vetted, although I don't know if that's entirely the correct term, but we really felt like if OSEP had worked collaboratively with CADRE, these are materials that we are confident in using with the citizens of our state. Just lastly, too, the bullet says well written. They are so well written. They're clear, and as Jan Sarek said earlier, too, just many nice ways of wording legal concepts, and that was very appealing to us at the State Education Agency. Well, we got enthused about them, and we were grateful for the print copies that we were going to be receiving from CADRE. And one of the things that went through our thoughts here at the State Education Agency was that most of the time, our technical assistance related to dispute resolution is on the telephone or by email, and we wind up sending lots of our resource information to whoever is contacting us electronically. And we really wanted to be able to do the same thing with the new CADRE materials for dispute resolution. And so we began talking with our state's Parent Training and Information Center, that's called the Pathfinder Parent Center, as well as our state P&A project for protection and advocacy. And we've had a long history of collaborating with both of these partners, and they were really similarly impressed with the new materials and eager to get them out there and available for citizens. And so what happened was we approached CADRE about, would there be some way to insert into your materials some North Dakota specific contact information? And everyone at CADRE, and when I mean everyone, they were great, all of them who responded to us, very considerate of our request, but they were cautious, and I understand why. They worked hard on developing these to make sure that the language was correct, both legally and in terms of the content level and how it would be read by a variety of consumers. And they were very careful about protecting that. And yet, they were listening to what we were saying about how could we get state-specific information into the actual document. What they had been preparing and saying that states could do was they could print stickers with state-specific information and insert it within the documents, which is great, and which we will do too for distribution at conferences and in mailings. But because we dispersed so much information online, we still wanted that North Dakota contact information in there. Amy Whitehorn at CADRE, in one of the conference calls that we had with CADRE, brought that up as a possibility that they could create a virtual sticker for us. Well, I thought that was wonderful, and what they wound up doing, as you see on the screen now, is creating a virtual sticker for North Dakota specifically, but it takes the address and contact information for our state education agency, for our Parent Training and Information Center, as well as our partners at the Protection and Advocacy Project. And any reader of these guides will have that information online available to them. And also the relay for any Spanish speaking, as well as persons who are deaf or hard of hearing, for the relay information for all of our separate agencies. So I wanted to emphasize that even though CADRE walks and talks the language of dispute resolution, in effect they practiced that with us. If you get my drift here, we had a little bit of a conflict because we wanted these available online. CADRE wanted to protect the integrity. They worked with us. They listened, they came up with alternatives. We tried a few things. We worked back and forth by email and conference call. What the outcome was for us was exactly what we had hoped for. And it doesn't impair the language at all within the documents, and they're available in our state. When we were asked by Marshall to submit a few bullets about what each of us presenters wanted to highlight, I included something that Marshall edited out, and I want to come bring it back. Marshall, you probably just have to take this. I thought that what CADRE did with us was a model for quality technical assistance. They listened, they mulled it over, they tried to help us, they figured out some options, they carried it out, and we were able to implement it. It truly became a win-win kind of experience. And again, for those of you who provide technical assistance, this was a great experience. So thank you to all of you at CADRE as well as OSEP for your work in preparing these materials.
Wow, thanks a lot, Bob. We really appreciate that, and I've always loved working with you. We always end up in a better place as a result of the back and forth and the interaction, and always learn a lot from you. So thank you. That was very kind. Heather Hebden, are you there?
I am.
Okay.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk with everybody about how we have utilized the different materials and bringing it to the families throughout the world. One of the things that's exciting about STOMP, the Specialized Training Military Parents Program, is that we like to work with the PTI and any other entities that are involved with families in the area. And because of this, we had the opportunity through an agreement with the United States Air Force to provide 52 trainings at installations throughout the world in 2012 and the beginning of 2013. And they contacted us again and asked us to do training at an additional 45 installations between October of last year and the 1st of November of this year. These will include and have included a number of installations where we have had the great opportunity to work with PTI and other. And we have, as a part of this training, when we received the 4 pamphlets, reviewed them carefully and looked at what they were able to provide to families. And even though some of our installations were overseas or in DoD systems, we felt the information was relevant to them as well. And so in every one of our trainings, we have inserted all 4 packets into the materials that the families receive, as well as the professionals. These packets have the curriculum that STOMP developed on a number of different topics, but the one thing that we had felt we wanted to be really good about was that whole issue of dispute resolution. And while it is one of the 6 principles in the IDEA, it really wasn't one that we wanted to put emphasis on and have people become feeling that that was where they had to go first. And so being able to point out these wonderful documents and then be able to talk about the key pieces of them was extremely helpful. And it reflected in what we heard from people. As you will see on this slide, there are 2 tremendous quotes. One was from a military professional out of Yokota, Japan. And this individual works with the schools there as well as with the Department of Defense uh, officers within that particular area. And when she said, I feel, well, a lot more equipped to help families and also know that I have tremendous resources that I can utilize if I have questions or need guidance. I felt that that said so much about not only what she saw for us being able to do to help them, but also what the materials had. The other one was a military parent who had been very frustrated when she came to the training and in fact was considering filing for due process against the against the school that served that installation. And she was able to hear what we were talking about and to get the information that we wanted to make sure was most critical. And I was so pleased when she asked us about facilitated IEPs and how that could be done for her child. And at the end of the thing, I will only point out that she said, if I ever have to go to a dispute resolution process, it will be mediation for me. I will be sharing this information right away at our parent group. She has a very active parent group, and the thought that this is somebody who had come into the meeting wanting us to tell her how she could stick it to the system, and instead heard us saying, you partner. This is all about working together, all about building relationships, and then providing her with materials and resources that she could take away and not just use for herself but share with others was to us probably the most beneficial aspect of this. We do, along with the PTI in Washington State, also disseminate these materials at workshops and at resource fairs and in a number of other venues that we would love to always share more about. I do very much like the idea of this virtual signature because I think that in our state that will be a great resource. And so don't think that we won't remember to ask you about things like that, Marshall. So I'm going to let it Carmen because I know that she's also got a lot to tell us. And so I'm going to turn it over to Marshall for you to turn over to Carmen.
Thank you very much, Heather. Before I turn it over to Carmen, and I'm not going to belabor this, but we grabbed some data that, and just a very quick blow through. We've had a Survey Monkey up and have asked people to let us know what they thought about the documents, and people have found them to be relevant, useful, and of high quality. We also received a number of comments, and I'm also not going to kind of walk through these, but people are using the guides in a number of different ways. State websites, they're handing them out, they're providing them to local districts, they're using them as source materials to update existing procedure manuals. There's a variety of ways that they are being used. We really want to encourage those of you who have received the documents to use them in any way that fits with your particular parent center or state needs. We are prepared to make small numbers of additional guides available at our expense, and we're willing to, for states or parent centers that have large orders, to make them available on a cost recovery basis. So we really, our continuing goal is to be sure that we're getting in the hands of folks who need and can use them. We also got lots of very positive comments. So, we at CADRE just continue to feel enormously grateful to all the folks who worked with us to get us to where we are now. And speaking of folks who worked with us, I want to turn it over to Carmen Sanchez. So Carmen, it's all yours.
Thank you, Marshall. I want to reiterate what Ruth had said about how excited we are that these publications are out. We know how complicated it is to explain parents' rights, and having tools that are as useful as this is going to be very helpful to anybody who reads them, and to, of course, the parent training information centers and state education agencies, even local educational agencies, as they try to explain to parents what are their options for resolving disputes. I also want to bring up a couple of issues that the guides in and of themselves are not the end all and be all. They're not a substitute for the actual law in IDEA, and therefore when parents, if they want to pursue their options, it's always behooves them to get even more information, to get more training, so that they feel even better prepared to go into any kind of dispute resolution. So it's really important that as we use these guides, we say it's not the law. The law is the law, and therefore has to be followed. The other thing is, as both Jan and Miriam alluded to, there was an attempt to get this at the lowest reading level possible, but then there's also the balance act of making them still sticking to the intent of the law. So many parents who have difficulties reading, or many parents who themselves might have disabilities that impacts their ability to read or impacts their ability to understand the material, will need additional resource, additional help in order to understand the guides, in order to have it understood and by them. I know that that's something that the parent training information centers and especially the community parent resource centers are very familiar with, because they very seldom give out materials without being there to provide any additional resources that might be needed. So I just wanted to have those two caveats, that they're not a substitute for the actual law in IDEA, and they will require in many cases further explanation, further hand-holding. But again, I just want to emphasize what a great tool it is. I read both the English and the Spanish versions, and I agree with everyone's comments. It's very difficult to get into language that can be understandable by a lot of people, the complexity of IDEA, and I think it does that. And I think it also adds simultaneously, and again, Jan and Heather alluded to this, and Miriam also, as did Bob, they simultaneously encourage the building of collaborative relationships among educators and about parents, so that they really come from the place that if we're all sharing the same information, we all have access to the same information, we know it well, then we can together come up with a solution that meets the needs of both our individual children as parents with disabilities, and in the larger sense of all the children who are served under IDEA and special education. And I think that spirit really comes through in all four publications, and I think that that's part of the reason why there's such a positive reaction to it, why the parents who attended Heather's training said, if I ever go to dispute resolution, it'll be mediation, because you see the benefit of working together, and that it's working together that you can resolve the issues, because regardless of how you solve a dispute, your child still has to get an education, and you still often have to see, you as a parent have to see the educator every day, the educator has to see you as a parent often, and work with your children. So I think that that's probably the most beneficial aspect of it, and certainly in keeping with CADRE's entire gestalt of being, that it is about working together and working towards collaborative relationships. Where to go? You have up here both the dispute resolution guides were exactly on CADRE's website they can be found, and of course a general link to CADRE's website, which I'm sure all of you have visited often, and I certainly visited often. So I encourage you to look at it and to look at the guides more closely if you already haven't done so. So with that, Marshall, I think I'll turn it back over to you if there's questions from the audience.
Thanks, Carmen. You know, it's interesting just thinking for a minute about the trajectory for these guides. There was the moment when Ruth asked us to do it, but actually the work on these guides goes back even before that to to a parent-centered needs assessment that CADRE did, where parents told us that what they really wanted was good information on dispute resolution processes. So as I think about the terrible importance that needs assessments have played in helping to direct our path, I just kind of go back to that. So as Carmen mentioned, we do have still a few minutes remaining. If anyone has a specific question or comment for any of the panelists, or you can either press #6 to unmute your phone and ask it, or you'd be welcome to add a question to the chat box. Now here's somebody just unmuted. Is there a question or a comment? Well, I see that several people are typing. While that's happening, I want to encourage those of you who are on the call to be sure to stay tuned to the CADRE website for announcements about future CADRE webinars. Also, if you don't already, to subscribe to the CADRE caucus. Phil Moses has become a household name with the caucus. That goes out every month to 2 months, and what it does is alert you about upcoming or recent CADRE products, services, opportunities. So I have a question from Pat Tyler, who asks, are there any plans to provide parents with coaching within their homes to help increase parent resiliency within the family unit? And I do not have CADRE does not have an answer to that question. I wonder if any of our panelists would have a response.
Hi, Marshall, it's Carmen. I think thinking through how families can be more resilient and helping parents to build that is one of the things that the Parent Training Information Centers and the Community Parent Resource Centers work on through their work with parents. They're not funded, nor do they have the resources to do the kind of intensive coaching that this question is asking here, which would require quite a bit of resources. But I think that what's been happening with Parent Training Information Centers, and also in many ways with CADRE, and the way in which you're approaching the development of products, is that we're moving more and more towards helping families be more resilient, being more empowered to take on their roles as their children, not only their children's advocates, but their children's first and greatest teachers, and those that will, so that they can see what they need to do in order to improve outcomes for children in the long run, from birth all the way into adulthood. So there is to answer the question bluntly, there is nothing I'm aware of for resources to do this kind of intense coaching in the homes. But the underlying question is about teaching families how to be empowered, and I do think that that's something that the PTIs and CPRCs have been doing for a while and will continue to do for a long time, and CADRE does through productions of materials like this.
Thank you, Carmen.
Marshall, this is Heather, and I just wanted to add one quick thing. One of the things, because of the war that we've had, the military has really pushed to find ways to strengthen resiliency within families, and we do have a great deal of information that we would be more than happy to share with the PTIs about some of the strategies that have been talked about for families to look at for resiliency, for reentry, for dealing with changes when a family member comes home with a disability, or when a family member does not return. And so there's some really good things. Of course, Birth to 3 has some terrific stuff that they've put out for the Department of Defense, as has Sesame Street. And those talk about resiliency and talking to families and to children. And I highly recommend them because I think that they have been wonderful resources for our families. And while some of them are specific to the issues of military, there are others that I think that are really able to be translated into civilian life and civilian issues. So I just wanted to add that.
Great, thank you, Heather. Let's see, we did have a question about whether mediation and resolution meetings were addressed in the guides, and in fact, there is a guide devoted to each of those topics. So the answer to that would be yes. There's also a question, a positive comment about Phil Moses and an expression of interest in the possibility that CADRE might host a webinar that would discuss some of the challenges that PTIs face as they work in the area of early dispute resolution and distinctions between advocacy and education. We would be really very interested in being a part of such a discussion. And whether we would host it or whether we would collaborate with parent centers, I think maybe what we will do, Kathy, is follow up with you and find out a little bit more about what you're thinking, and then if there are others who have ideas and would be interested, we could talk about what something might look like and whether it would be something CADRE would host. So actually, if you're on this webinar and have an interest in that topic and might like to kind of get on a conference call with us and think about how that might look, would you please either put your name in the box or send us an email, and we'll figure out how to proceed on that. So, just looking to see if we have anything else. I think that looks like there are a couple of people who are still typing. We have a couple of minutes left. Oh, great. And Deborah has said that SIPR would be delighted to coordinate with Phil around a webinar to discuss that. So it sounds like we maybe try to get Phil and Deborah and Kathy and others who let us know. Looks like STEP would be interested together on a conference call to figure out how we might move forward on that. Oh, great. A lot of people are interested in working on it. So if there are any further questions or comments?
Marshall, this is Heather, and our line went down for some reason, and please put me on that list.
Great. You're there, Heather.
Thank you.
Number of others are typing. I think what we're going to do is we will leave the line open just so that we can get the names of folks who are interested in being a part of that group. But if there's no further questions, I believe that we are going to go ahead and wrap this up. Really appreciate all of you joining us, and watch for future CADRE webinars.